I'm an avid hiker, and I was exploring Utah during a cross-country trip I took after breaking up with the person I thought would become my fiancée. Long story short, I caught her messing around with one of my closest friends, a complete betrayal on both sides. I was 31. Utah was one of the states I was most excited to pass through. It has some incredible forests that every hiker dreams of exploring. I chose the Wasatch National Forest as my Utah destination because I'd heard a lot of good things about it. One of its biggest draws for me was the seclusion it offered. I prefer hiking alone, so bustling trails aren't really my thing. I picked an unnamed area of the forest and drove as far down a narrow access road as I could. I parked, stepped out, and took in my surroundings. After gearing up, I checked my phone, no service, just the way I like it. I made a mental note of my starting point and began the trek. I know hiking alone in uncharted areas can be risky, but following a designated route just doesn't give me the same thrill. I always download a digital map of the area I'm exploring. Many people don't realize your phone's GPS still works without cell service. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, but no, I didn't get lost. I wish that was what this story was about. The reality of what happened is something I still struggle to understand. My destination was a lookout point at the summit, maybe 3 or 4 miles away. The terrain was rough, so I was only clearing about 1.5 miles an hour. About an hour into my hike, it started raining lightly. I hate hiking in the rain, so I turned around and began retracing my steps. Eventually, I saw my car in the distance, relieved this failed outing would soon be over. But as I approached, I was horrified. All 4 tires were slashed. Panic set in. There was no way this was a coincidence. It was deliberate. I whipped my head around, scanning the forest in every direction. I listened as carefully as I could, but the sound of raindrops on leaves drowned out everything else. I was stranded without cell service and had no choice but to find higher ground. Returning to the summit was my best option for getting a signal. I didn't feel safe walking the 20 miles down the open road, so I headed back into the woods. About halfway to the summit, I heard faint rustling behind me, maybe 40 yards away. The sound would start and stop in sync with my movements. I didn't want to look, so I picked up the pace, hoping I was a faster hiker than whoever or whatever was following me. By the time I reached the peak, the sun was setting, casting eerie shadows across the forest. Miraculously, I had service. I called the police, explaining where my car was and my suspicion that I was being stalked. I also mentioned I had AAA, relieved that someone knew where I was. I now faced a daunting problem. I'd have to navigate back through the forest before dark, while somehow avoiding whoever was out there. I couldn't just march straight back, so I decided to walk in a semicircle toward my car, hoping to avoid any trap. Things were going well for a while. I hadn't heard any unusual sounds. But then, about 30 seconds after thinking that, I heard a twig snap to my left. I turned to look but saw nothing. Minutes later, another sound came from directly behind me. My blood ran cold. I realized there were multiple people out there. I picked up the pace again, settling into a light jog. Then, as if things weren't terrifying enough, I stumbled upon a hidden makeshift campsite. There were about a dozen logs in a circle around a campfire. Someone had been there recently. I jogged around it and continued, glancing behind me every so often. Soon I saw someone's foot disappear behind a tree. That was it. My light jog turned into a full-on sprint. As I ran, the sounds around me grew louder, making it clear I was being chased. At one point, I couldn't resist and looked over my shoulder. I counted at least 6 people, all wearing white, charging toward me. I kept running, knowing my car wasn't far. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my life. Imagine being exhausted with the threat of death looming over you, yet you can't slow down. Finally, I saw my car and a police officer standing nearby. I reached him and collapsed, almost throwing up before he could speak. When I looked back, those people were nowhere in sight. The cop had called AAA, and I gave him a full report. What he told me was chilling. Apparently, Utah has the largest population of Mormons in the country, and it's not uncommon to encounter reclusive woods folk in unmarked areas. The specific forest I was in had a history of cults and secluded religious groups. The cop told me I had likely stumbled upon one, and exploring a random part of the woods alone was risky. I still think about that day all the time. If they were mad I was on their land, why not just tell me? I don't understand why they felt the need to stalk and chase me, especially after slashing my tires. This experience is something I'll never fully make sense of. I'm a 15-year-old guy working at an amusement park in upstate New York. This happened only a year ago, and it still gives me chills thinking about it. It was a crisp October Sunday, one of the last few days the park would be open before it closed for the season until May. It seemed like just another normal day at work, but I was wrong. After checking in and working at my station for about 5 hours, I looked at my watch. It was 4:55 p.m. and my shift was ending in 5 minutes. I felt relieved and exhausted as I began packing up my things. Just then, a man with a scraggly beard and messy hair approached me. He was wearing a gray t-shirt with a few stains and black sweatpants full of holes. I thought to myself, just one more customer, and then I'm done. "Can I help you?" I asked the man. He stared at me for a few seconds, then kept turning his head as if someone were following him. I started feeling uneasy. "Sir, can I help you?" I repeated, trying to hide my annoyance. Finally, after a couple of seconds, he responded in a whisper, stuttering, "Where are your bathrooms?" "Up the hill to the right," I replied, trying to keep my tone friendly. The man started walking in that direction, but he kept glancing back at me as he went. I avoided eye contact, feeling more unsettled than ever. Just then, one of my coworkers came to take over my spot. I grabbed my things and practically sprinted through the park to the back room, where I clocked out and headed to the bathroom to change out of my work clothes. Then I went to the employee parking lot, where I waited for my coworker Jordan, who was 17, to pick me up. After waiting what felt like forever, Jordan finally arrived. Before going home, we stopped by a local diner to grab some cheeseburgers for dinner. While we were eating, I noticed something odd. The same man I'd helped find the bathrooms at the park was at the diner, sitting a couple of tables down, staring right at me. My heart skipped a beat. I told Jordan about it, and he just shrugged it off. "Probably just a coincidence, Ben. Don't worry," he said. "Yeah," I replied, though I was still pretty uneasy. After dinner, we got back in the car and started the 35-minute drive home. At the first red light, I glanced to my right, and my heart skipped another beat. There, sitting in a white Honda, was the same man from the park and diner. He was staring directly at me. I told Jordan, and he started to worry too. Once we got to our street, we took a couple of extra laps around the block to make sure the man wasn't following us. Once it seemed clear, Jordan finally dropped me off at home. My mom and sister were out at the mall, and my dad was on a business trip, so I was home alone. After heading straight to bed, I heard a noise outside my window. Slowly, I got up and looked outside, and what I saw will forever send chills down my spine. There, standing on my front lawn, was the man staring directly at my window, smiling. I immediately grabbed my phone and called 911, but by the time the police arrived, he was gone. I quit my job at the amusement park right after it closed for the winter. I haven't seen the man since, but this is an experience I'll never forget. What I'm about to share was one of the last memories from middle school, and not for a good reason. I'd argue it was the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to me. Back then, I didn't have many friends, but the few I had were all a bit odd, just like me. There was Greg, Jay, Mark, and me. We were inseparable, and it seemed like we'd be friends forever. But looking back, it was pretty clear that Jay and I were starting to distance ourselves from Mark and Greg. Still, that summer, Greg invited the three of us on a week-long trip to Maine. Greg's family had a summer home on one of the small islands in Casco Bay. None of us even knew it existed until he invited us. His family was pretty secretive about the place, which only added to its mysterious appeal. The drive was long and uncomfortable. I had a runny nose the entire time, which clearly annoyed Greg's dad, a germaphobe who made me uncomfortable whenever he shot me a disapproving look. Mark and I also bickered about something silly, which was typical for us. Eventually, we drove onto a ferry to get to the island, and that part was actually fun. The house was small but charming. Something about it felt surreal, almost as if it was in a different world. The island had a dreamy feel to it. Everyone seemed to know each other, and people would wave at Greg when they passed. We spent most of our time biking around, which never got old at our age. On the second day of the trip, I realized my Barcelona snapback cap was missing. I was a huge soccer fan, and it was one of my favorite possessions. Greg suggested I'd left it on the beach, but I was almost sure I'd brought it back. I remember being upset, but Greg's dad told me to get over it and not ruin the trip. so I let it go, but I still felt uneasy. The next day, after hours of biking, I noticed one of my pens was missing. I had a small pen collection that I took everywhere, so losing one felt devastating. Jay said he remembered seeing me with it earlier, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I didn't want to make a fuss in front of Greg's dad, so I pretended I was feeling sick and spent the rest of the evening in bed. I ended up falling asleep early, so I wasn't too surprised when I woke up around 3 a.m., unable to fall back asleep. As I lay there, I started to hear faint whispering. I froze, straining to listen, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like it was coming from Mark's bed, across the room, but I wasn't certain. For some reason, I was too scared to speak up. Eventually, I blocked it out and fell back asleep. The next morning, I tried to forget about the whispering. We were playing a game in the yard when Mark said he needed to use the bathroom. He was gone for a while, which wasn't unusual, but when I glanced back at the house, I did a double take. In one of the second-floor windows, Mark was staring blankly at us. I figured he was in the bathroom, but then I remembered Greg's house didn't have a second-floor bathroom. I turned to see if either Greg or Jay had noticed, but they hadn't. When I looked back at the house, Mark was gone. Later, Greg's dad planned to take us out for dinner, but I pretended to be sick again, opting to stay behind. As I lay in bed, the unsettling image of Mark staring at us lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake it, and something compelled me to investigate. I got up and started looking around Mark's bunk. My heart nearly stopped when I found my missing Barcelona cap in his duffel bag. Digging deeper, I found more of my things. Items I hadn't even realized were missing, like a nail clipper my mom had packed, my extra toothbrush, and most disturbingly, a pair of my underwear. I was on the verge of tears when I noticed something else in the bag, his notebook. Sometimes, even to this day, I regret opening it. My middle school brain wasn't ready for what I found. The notebook was filled with pencil sketches, some so aggressively scribbled that they had torn through the pages. There were drawings of monsters, violent scenes, and people being tortured. It was sick, worse than sick. It was disturbing. And then I saw drawings of me. The image I'll never forget was a drawing of me on a cross, my legs missing. The last few pages were all pictures of me, and on one page my name was scribbled over 100 times. The final page had my name at the top, followed by 4 haunting words, "I'll do it tomorrow." When everyone returned, I quietly pulled Greg's dad aside and told him what I'd found. He didn't believe me until I showed him the notebook. Horrified, he told me to put everything back as I'd found it. I didn't want to, but he was the adult, so I complied. I made a split-second decision to tear out one of the pages as proof. Greg's dad quickly told everyone there was a family emergency and that we had to cut the trip short. As we packed, I could feel Mark's gaze burning into my back. I was terrified to even glance his way. We left immediately, catching the first ferry off the island, and drove straight home without stopping. Greg's dad dropped Mark off first, then Jay and Greg, who lived on the same street. As he drove me home, Greg's dad advised me not to mention anything to my parents, likely because his family was close with Mark's. But as soon as I got home, I broke down and told my parents everything. They were furious and called the police. The officers questioned me, and I showed them the page I'd taken from Mark's notebook. That was enough for them to obtain a warrant. They found the notebook and returned most of my belongings, though they never recovered my pen. My parents didn't tell me much about what happened next, but I never saw Mark again. His family moved, and he didn't return to school. I stopped hanging out with Greg after that too. The reason I'm writing this now is because last week I received an anonymous letter in the mail. Inside there was a single line, "I remember everything." Wrapped in the letter was the pen Mark had taken from me all those years ago. I have no idea how he found my address or why it's taken him so long to reach out. I'm honestly considering moving apartments. I was 9 years old when this happened. For whatever reason, I was home alone one night, playing video games upstairs in my room. I wasn't allowed to answer the door to anyone when I was alone, and whenever I was left on my own, it was never for long. My mom would usually just be out grocery shopping or running a quick errand. I was playing Metroid Prime on my GameCube, one of my favorite games, when I heard the house phone downstairs start ringing. My mom always told me to pick up the phone if it rang when she was out, just in case it was her. I hurried downstairs, and by maybe the 4th ring, I picked up. The caller ID showed my mom's cell phone number. "Sweetie, can you come outside and help with the groceries?" a voice said. "Mom?" I asked, hesitantly. "Yes," she replied. But something sounded off in her voice. You know your own mom's voice, and even at that age, I felt that it didn't quite sound like her. "Why do you sound like that?" I asked. "Like what, sweetie?" she responded. I hung up right then. My mom would never use sweetie like that, especially not twice in a row. Then the phone rang again, and once more, my mom's number showed up on the caller ID. I ignored it this time, feeling a wave of anxiety. My heart was racing, and I just sat there in the kitchen, waiting to see if the phone would ring a third time. A couple of minutes later it did, but this time the caller ID showed a different number. I picked up, and a man's voice on the other end said, "Hey James, I know this is going to sound strange, but it's your dad. I'm outside." All I could mutter was, "What?" "I'm outside. I have a lot to explain," he continued. I hung up immediately. My dad had passed away when I was 3. I had no memory of him. Now I was certain the first voice I'd heard wasn't my mom's. The phone rang again, and then again after that. I ignored it each time. I couldn't even call my mom because someone obviously had her phone. Things took an even scarier turn when there was a knock at the front door. This was no longer just a case of someone having my mom's phone, someone was actually outside. I knew my mom wouldn't be knocking, she had a key. I peered around the wall from the kitchen to look at the door. I heard a man's muffled voice on the other side calling my name. He said, "It's your dad." He rang the doorbell and then tried to open the door. I did something no 9-year-old should ever have to do. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. The operator asked me some questions, then told me to wait in a bathroom or another lockable room until the police arrived. The downstairs bathroom was nearby, so I ran to it and locked myself in, leaving the lights off. Whoever was outside then started trying the windows, attempting to open each one. I heard them moving from one window to another, struggling to pry them open. If any of them had been unlocked, this story might have ended very differently. Eventually, they must have given up before the police arrived. I say they because there were clearly 2 people involved, a man and a woman. For all I knew, they both could have been outside. The 911 operator finally told me the police were at the front door, and it was safe to come out. Only when I saw the officers did I finally hang up the phone. They did a quick investigation around the house and asked me where my mom was supposed to be, and if she knew anyone who might want to harm us. "I thought she was just out grocery shopping," I said, adding that, as far as I knew, no one wanted to hurt us. My mom returned shortly after with my little sister and was panicked when she saw the police cars. It turned out her phone had been stolen, as we'd guessed. I'm sure our address, home phone number, and other personal information were saved somewhere on the phone, making it easy for someone to find us. How they knew my name is still a mystery, but something on the phone must have given it away. It was an old Nokia flip phone, and the background was a photo of her, my sister, and me. That photo alone could have tipped off some creepy individuals that the phone's owner was a single mom with young kids. It seemed they'd used that to try and lure me outside, which is disgusting and horrifying. The phone was never recovered. It must have been destroyed after their failed attempt to trick me. Things were a bit different after that night. My mom wouldn't leave me alone at night again, until I was a few years older. When I was younger, my childhood home was the go-to spot for hangouts. There were a few reasons for this. My dad had a massive man cave in the basement, with what felt like an endless supply of beer, and my parents generally let us drink down there without much supervision. I lived on a large piece of land, and my property bordered a decent-sized forest. If you walked through the woods from my house, you'd find yourself on a dirt road. On the other side of that road was the reservoir, a place that held a special place in my heart since I was a kid. I'd cut countless holes in the reservoir fence over the years, so many that the Water Commission eventually stopped repairing them. Technically, it was illegal to trespass on reservoir property, but as a kid, it was my sanctuary. I'd go there to smoke, escape my parents, swim, or just think. It was beautiful, and honestly, probably the only thing I truly miss from that time in my life. One night, my friends and I were shooting pool in my basement with some loud music playing in the background when my friend Chester came up with the idea of hiking through the woods to the reservoir. We were getting bored, so we all agreed. Plus, the sun was still up, so navigating wouldn't be too difficult. There were 5 of us, me, Chester, Rick, Jasper, and Hassan. Rick and Hassan grabbed some beers for the journey since they were the group's drinkers. I'd already had a few, so I didn't want to overdo it. The reservoir was massive, so even after crossing the fence, we still had a bit of a hike ahead. The woods were still a bit muddy from an earlier rain, but we were already committed. We usually hung out on a cliff near the reservoir, so we headed there first. After a while, though, we decided to keep walking to the far side of the reservoir, a spot we called the beach because of its smooth, sandy shoreline. After about 20 minutes of walking, we found ourselves on the far side. That's when things started getting weird. Hassan suddenly raised his hand and pointed into the distance. We were on the far side of the oval-shaped reservoir, but we hadn't reached the beach yet. He was pointing to our right, where we saw something moving toward the reservoir along the same side we were on, just much further down. The five of us fell silent, watching as a dark figure slowly approached the water, dragging something behind them. At first we were excited, thinking we might encounter someone, which we usually welcomed. But as the figure moved closer to the water and out of the woods, we realized they were dragging a large, black garbage bag. Whatever was in it was heavy, given how slowly they were moving. Now, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but over the years, a few bodies had been found in that reservoir. In that moment, we assumed the worst. Our chatter stopped. We just stared in silence as the figure dragged what we feared might be a body toward the water's edge. When they reached the shore, they knelt down by the bag for a few minutes. We couldn't tell what they were doing from so far away. We figured it was time to get out of there while they were distracted. But before we could leave, Chester spotted something else: 3 more figures emerging from the woods, 2 dragging bags and 1 carrying a kayak overhead. I started feeling sick. We lived only 10 minutes from one of the most crime-ridden towns in America, so if this was somehow gang-related, it wouldn't have been shocking. The first man got into the kayak, while the others loaded a bag onto his lap. We watched as he rowed to the middle of the reservoir and let the bag sink below the surface. He repeated this process with 2 more bags. And then, like a scene from a horror movie, my phone rang. The obnoxious ringtone shattered the silence, and I fumbled to silence it. The men froze and turned in our direction, and that's when we ran. Rick glanced over his shoulder and yelled that they were following us. It was the scariest moment of my life. Running through a forest is hard enough, but with the threat of danger, it was terrifying. We ran down the bank, cut across, and started making our way through the woods on the near side, heading back to the hole in the fence. But in my panic, I couldn't remember where the hole was. I reached the fence first, with my friends close behind. They started panicking when they saw me frantically searching for the opening. Finally, Rick spotted it and shouted, and we all dashed toward it. As I helped Chester through, I heard a branch snap nearby, and I knew they were close. The chase didn't end there. We kept running through the woods all the way back to my backyard. Once we were safe, Hassan called the police. I knew we'd be in trouble for trespassing, but I didn't care at that point. My friends were relieved, but I wasn't so sure. The path from the reservoir to my house wasn't far, and they could easily track us. The police arrived and listened to our story. They searched the property for any sign we'd been followed, and my stomach dropped when they actually found something: muddy footprints leading to my backyard fence. I told the officers they weren't ours. When they asked if I was sure, I explained that we wouldn't jump our own fence. Thankfully, the police didn't find anyone on my property. They left but promised to keep me updated about the reservoir situation. Surprisingly, they did. A few days later, they retrieved 3 bodies from the reservoir. No shock there, but it became a huge news story. My family and I were on edge for months, knowing criminals knew where we lived. My mom even swore she saw people in the woods at night, and once claimed she saw a camera flash. This incident was one of the main reasons we eventually moved out. Fast forward to today, and as far as I know, the police never made any arrests or found a connection. I'm sharing this now because I recently came across a news article about a teenager drowning in that reservoir, which brought all these memories flooding back. That place is definitely cursed, and I still wonder about all the tragedies that may have occurred there, unknown to anyone. When my cousin Cody and I were in our early 20s, we went on a handful of camping trips around Colorado. This happened, I believe, when I was 22 and he was 23, in Arapahoe Forest. It was my first time camping there, though not Cody's. It was the middle of the week. Our jobs allowed us to have days off then, so we'd often go on our campouts to avoid traffic and crowds. I always let Cody take charge on these trips. He's the Eagle Scout, not me. We parked by a picnic area and set foot into the woods from there. After about 15 minutes of hiking, we found a good spot to set up camp. A good spot meaning a big enough clearing to fit 2 tents, a portable stove, and a campfire. The first thing we did was unpack and set up our tents. Cody has always been a lot quicker than me at pitching a tent. He can do it in minutes, while it usually takes me over 20. Or rather, it used to take me over 20 minutes. I haven't camped in the wilderness since this trip. Next, we created a ring of stones for a fire, then gathered sticks and wood. Cody brought fire starters and a lighter, so we didn't exactly go old school, but oh well. By then, the sun was setting. We got a fire going and Cody started grilling some steak and burgers. One thing about Cody, he always went all out with the food on these trips, and he's a great cook. Of course, we had our bear spray ready, just in case the smell of the food attracted a black bear, though Cody always said that was unlikely. The real thing to worry about out here is other people, he'd say. As we ate, we cracked open some beers and played classic rock on the speaker. If you've never been camping, it's hard to understand just how amazing the vibe is out in the wilderness with a friend, some beers, and good music. As it got dark, we started playing cards on this little folding table we brought specifically for games. After some traditional card games, we moved on to Uno, and that's when we heard something out in the woods. I paused the music on my phone so the speaker would go silent. Now we could hear it clearly, a person humming and footsteps crunching on leaves beyond the trees in the pitch-black forest. Cody urged me to grab the flashlight. By the time I found it, though, the sounds had faded away. I asked Cody if it was something to be concerned about, and he admitted it was unusual for anyone to be this deep in the woods, especially someone walking near a campsite with an active fire and humming loudly. We were both shaken, though Cody tried to brush it off. We went back to playing cards, keeping the music much lower. Just as we started to relax, a big stick landed in the middle of our campsite, making us both jump out of our skin. It hadn't fallen from a tree, someone had thrown it. Cody yelled, something along the lines of, "Whoever's out there messing with us, get a life." Then we heard footsteps again, retreating into the distance. I suggested we pack up and move to another spot, but Cody refused to move in the dark. We both had bear spray, and he advised me to keep it next to me in my tent when we went to sleep. We kept hearing sounds like branches snapping in the distance. These weren't sounds you'd expect an animal to make. It was clear someone, maybe even multiple people, were out there. Eventually, we had to sleep, so we agreed to take turns keeping watch to ensure no one came into our camp to steal anything or worse. Cody took the first watch and said he'd stay up and read his book. I crawled into my tent, climbed into my sleeping bag, and eventually drifted off. Waking up in the middle of the night while camping is normal. You're in a cold, outdoor environment, lying in an uncomfortable sleeping bag. I wasn't sure what woke me up, but my mind was foggy. Then, as I slowly came to, I looked up and saw a head peering into my tent. I thought it was Cody. I rubbed my eyes, but the darkness made it hard to make out any facial details. "Cody?" I asked groggily, thinking it was my turn to keep watch. I watched as the head stared at me, then the tent zipper quickly zipped up, and the figure disappeared. I lay back down, but only for a second before a terrifying realization hit me. I shot upright, listening as footsteps walked away from my tent. "Cody?" I called. No answer. I unzipped my tent and looked around the campsite. The fire was out, and Cody wasn't there. I went to his tent, which was zipped up, and when I unzipped it, I found Cody fast asleep in his sleeping bag. I got chills. My stomach dropped. I started shaking him awake, and when he finally came to, I told him someone was at our campsite. It took him a minute to process, but once he did, he grabbed his bear spray. He admitted he must have dozed off while reading. He suggested I sleep in his tent with him for the rest of the night, but I needed my sleeping bag. He stood watch outside as I ran to my tent to grab it. Just as I was grabbing my bag, I heard that same humming again coming from outside. I froze and Cody whispered for me to hurry. I asked if he could hear it too. "Yes," he replied. We both went back to his tent, zipped it up, and held our cans of bear spray at the ready. I'll tell you, in those moments, I wanted nothing more than for a bear to show up and scare off whoever was out there. The hours dragged on as I stayed up while Cody slept. After 3 long, tense hours, I woke him, and we switched shifts. When he woke me up, it was almost dawn, and there was enough light to start packing up. By the time we finished, it was fully light out, and we could safely hike back to the car. We could have found another spot to camp for the night, but neither of us felt like it anymore. We both just wanted to be back in the safety of our homes. It's been 6 years since this happened, and Cody's hit me up a few times about going camping, but I haven't really had the interest since. People can be scarier than any wild animal out there. The thought of someone stalking our campsite or the image of that head peering into my tent in the dark, it's straight out of a nightmare. I may never go camping again, honestly. The story is still fresh in my mind, as it literally happened just last week. My extended family is unique. I won't get into all the details, but everyone is either a gun enthusiast, an avid hunter, or both. Most families go on vacation in the summer, but mine tends to plan trips around wintertime. We don't do typical vacations though. Every season, the adults pool money to rent a house in some remote location, usually deep in the woods. This time, we stayed in a cabin in Vermont, but calling it a cabin doesn't do it justice. It was more like a castle to fit everyone. Now, here's where it gets strange. As a family, we play a lot of odd games, most of them involving shooting in some capacity. The weirdest one happens on the second to last night. All the adults suit up in warm clothing and head outside into the woods for a massive game of laser tag. I know it sounds ridiculous. Believe me, I'm no stranger to people walking out of my life because of my family's quirks. The winner every year claims a pretty substantial prize pot and, of course, bragging rights. We play with a high-grade laser tag set that my Uncle Lucian made himself. He's the most fanatical about the game. The rules are simple. It's every person for themselves, and the last one tagged wins. If multiple people are left by midnight, the prize is split. Once you're tagged, you make your way to the fire pit outside the house. When the second to last person returns, everyone fires a round in the air to signal the last player that they've won. This year was special for me. I just turned 18, so it was my first time being allowed to join the game. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't thrilled, not even for the prize, but just because it seemed like a blast. As we geared up to head outside, Uncle Lucian made sure everyone knew how to use the equipment and where to place the markers for fairness. Then he told us to set 10-minute timers on our phones to start, and without any warning, he sprinted into the woods as if he were racing. My relatives all scattered in different directions after him. Most of them had headed uphill, so I figured that going downhill would give me a better chance of lasting longer. It was dark, but the snow on the ground made things easier to see. I don't remember exactly how many of us were playing, but it was a lot, at least 10 of my cousins and several parents, including mine. Our family is massive. After venturing deep into the forest, I found a little perch where I could see far up the hill, so I decided to sit and catch my breath. I waited there for a while, strategizing. If I kept moving along the slope, I thought I might eventually work my way upward and surprise anyone left up there. So I walked along the slope for about 15 minutes, putting as much distance as possible between me and the house. Time wasn't an issue. There were still around 2 hours until midnight. As I started up the slope, I suddenly heard a faint crunching sound over my left shoulder in the direction opposite the house. I jumped behind the nearest tree, hoping whoever was there wouldn't get a clear shot. I looked over but saw nothing until I noticed a faint trail of footprints leading to a thick tree about 15 yards behind me. Someone was standing behind that tree, but it hit me. Why hadn't they just tagged me? I was out in the open, completely unaware of their presence. It was as if they were stalking me. I started running uphill, hoping to get out of range. As I moved, I noticed another set of footprints further to the left. These were strange, coming from deeper in the woods and looping back around. Had someone tried to flank me, they'd have had to go farther than I did, which seemed unlikely. Then I heard a muffled thud from the slope I'd just climbed, as if someone had fallen into the snow. My heart raced, and I bolted back toward the house. When I checked my phone, it was already past 11. An hour had slipped by without me noticing. I kept running and came across a fresh path of footprints leading toward the house. Excited, I sped up, hoping to catch someone off guard.
As I passed a line of trees, I spotted my cousin Corbo walking at a steady pace, laser gun in hand. I crouched and pulled out my pistol, aiming at his marker. It blinked, signaling a hit, and he slammed his fist against a tree in frustration before trudging back toward the house. I grinned, thrilled to have gotten my first kill.
Riding the adrenaline, I hatched a plan to ambush whoever might be following me. I sprinted ahead, then doubled back and hid behind a tree, leaving no visible trail. It was perfect. No one would suspect I was hiding there. Just then, my marker started blinking out of nowhere. I was furious. The shot had come from where I'd just been. Whoever was stalking me was definitely toying with me, keeping their laser fixed on me even as I turned to face them. Determined to see who it was, I walked toward the laser beam, which never wavered. As I got closer, I could make out a figure's hands holding the gun, their body concealed behind a tree. Then, out of nowhere, I heard gunshots from behind me, making me jump. I froze. That was the signal that the game was over. I must have been the last one. But then, who had just shot me? I turned back to the laser beam still trained on me, and the person holding the gun stepped out from behind the tree. It was a stranger. Even worse, there were two of them, standing side by side. I whipped around as I heard a crunch from behind me, and there was another man in a ski mask, holding a trash bag in one hand and a knife in the other. He locked eyes with me and started sprinting. Panicked, I dropped my gear and ran, screaming as I dodged trees, trying not to trip in the snow. I could hear all three of them closing in, shouting words I couldn't understand. I sprinted through the trees, the lights of the house finally visible in the distance. My legs were starting to give out, but I forced myself to keep going.
Just as I reached the clearing, I saw Uncle Lucian running toward me, rifle in hand. He aimed above my head and fired 3 shots into the air. I heard the footsteps behind me stop as my pursuers tripped and retreated into the woods. I collapsed at Lucian's feet, gasping for air, and passed out from sheer exhaustion.
The next morning was a blur. My aunt explained she had tripped during the game and dropped her laser gun, which explained how those guys in the woods had one. Corbo had tagged 6 people before I got him, making him the final kill. Lucian and my dad tried to track the stranger's footprints, but there were too many paths and dead ends to follow. The adults reported everything to the house owners and the police. The next morning, I woke to yelling from downstairs. Lucian was shouting at the woods. When I looked outside, I saw a single snowman facing the house. In its hand was the laser gun my aunt had dropped. Lucian fired a few rounds into the snowman's head before storming back inside. The story is still fresh in my mind, as it literally happened just last week. My extended family is unique. I won't get into all the details, but everyone is either a gun enthusiast, an avid hunter, or both. Most families go on vacation in the summer, but mine tends to plan trips around wintertime. We don't do typical vacations, though. Every season, the adults pool money to rent a house in some remote location, usually deep in the woods. This time, we stayed in a cabin in Vermont, but calling it a cabin doesn't do it justice. It was more like a castle to fit everyone. Now, here's where it gets strange. As a family, we play a lot of odd games, most of them involving shooting in some capacity. The weirdest one happens on the second to last night. All the adults suit up in warm clothing and head outside into the woods for a massive game of laser tag. I know it sounds ridiculous. Believe me, I'm no stranger to people walking out of my life because of my family's quirks. The winner every year claims a pretty substantial prize pot and, of course, bragging rights. We play with a high-grade laser tag set that my Uncle Lucian made himself. He's the most fanatical about the game. The rules are simple. It's every person for themselves, and the last one tagged wins. If multiple people are left by midnight, the prize is split. Once you're tagged, you make your way to the fire pit outside the house. When the second to last person returns, everyone fires a round in the air to signal the last player that they've won. This year was special for me. I just turned 18. So it was my first time being allowed to join the game. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't thrilled, not even for the prize, but just because it seemed like a blast. As we geared up to head outside, Uncle Lucian made sure everyone knew how to use the equipment and where to place the markers for fairness. Then he told us to set 10-minute timers on our phones to start. And without any warning, he sprinted into the woods as if he were racing. My relatives all scattered in different directions after him. Most of them had headed uphill, so I figured that going downhill would give me a better chance of lasting longer. It was dark, but the snow on the ground made things easier to see. I don't remember exactly how many of us were playing, but it was a lot, at least 10 of my cousins and several parents, including mine. Our family is massive. After venturing deep into the forest, I found a little perch where I could see far up the hill, so I decided to sit and catch my breath. I waited there for a while, strategizing. If I kept moving along the slope, I thought I might eventually work my way upward and surprise anyone left up there. So I walked along the slope for about 15 minutes, putting as much distance as possible between me and the house. Time wasn't an issue. There were still around 2 hours until midnight. As I started up the slope, I suddenly heard a faint crunching sound over my left shoulder in the direction opposite the house. I jumped behind the nearest tree, hoping whoever was there wouldn't get a clear shot. I looked over but saw nothing until I noticed a faint trail of footprints leading to a thick tree about 15 yards behind me. Someone was standing behind that tree, but it hit me. Why hadn't they just tagged me? I was out in the open, completely unaware of their presence. It was as if they were stalking me. I started running uphill, hoping to get out of range. As I moved, I noticed another set of footprints further to the left. These were strange, coming from deeper in the woods and looping back around. Had someone tried to flank me, they'd have had to go farther than I did, which seemed unlikely. Then I heard a muffled thud from the slope I'd just climbed, as if someone had fallen into the snow. My heart raced, and I bolted back toward the house. When I checked my phone, it was already past 11. An hour had slipped by without me noticing. I kept running and came across a fresh path of footprints leading toward the house. Excited, I sped up, hoping to catch someone off guard.
As I passed a line of trees, I spotted my cousin Corbo walking at a steady pace, laser gun in hand. I crouched and pulled out my pistol, aiming at his marker. It blinked, signaling a hit, and he slammed his fist against a tree in frustration before trudging back toward the house. I grinned, thrilled to have gotten my first kill.
Riding the adrenaline, I hatched a plan to ambush whoever might be following me. I sprinted ahead, then doubled back and hid behind a tree, leaving no visible trail. It was perfect, no one would suspect I was hiding there. Just then, my marker started blinking out of nowhere. I was furious the shot had come from where I'd just been. Whoever was stalking me was definitely toying with me, keeping their laser fixed on me even as I turned to face them. Determined to see who it was, I walked toward the laser beam, which never wavered. As I got closer, I could make out a figure's hands holding the gun, their body concealed behind a tree. Then, out of nowhere, I heard gunshots from behind me, making me jump. I froze. That was the signal that the game was over. I must have been the last one. But then, who had just shot me? I turned back to the laser beam still trained on me, and the person holding the gun stepped out from behind the tree. It was a stranger. Even worse, there were two of them, standing side by side. I whipped around as I heard a crunch from behind me, and there was another man in a ski mask, holding a trash bag in one hand and a knife in the other. He locked eyes with me and started sprinting. Panicked, I dropped my gear and ran, screaming as I dodged trees, trying not to trip in the snow. I could hear all three of them closing in, shouting words I couldn't understand. I sprinted through the trees, the lights of the house finally visible in the distance. My legs were starting to give out, but I forced myself to keep going.
Just as I reached the clearing, I saw Uncle Lucian running toward me, rifle in hand. He aimed above my head and fired 3 shots into the air. I heard the footsteps behind me stop as my pursuers tripped and retreated into the woods. I collapsed at Lucian's feet, gasping for air, and passed out from sheer exhaustion.
The next morning was a blur. My aunt explained she had tripped during the game and dropped her laser gun, which explained how those guys in the woods had one. Corbo had tagged 6 people before I got him, making him the final kill. Lucian and my dad tried to track the stranger's footprints, but there were too many paths and dead ends to follow. The adults reported everything to the house owners and the police. The next morning, I woke to yelling from downstairs. Lucian was shouting at the woods. When I looked outside, I saw a single snowman facing the house. In its hand was the laser gun my aunt had dropped. Lucian fired a few rounds into the snowman's head before storming back inside. I live in Washington State, in the Pacific Northwest. I used to work at a late-night diner on the side of the highway. I was 29 years old and often worked the closing shift. The diner closed at 2 a.m., which was pretty late, considering how sparsely populated the area was. Even so, given the proximity to the highway, there would usually be at least 1 or 2 customers in the building until closing time. Having grown up in the South and then moving up here, I noticed a difference in how people interact. In the South, there's a big emphasis on hospitality and small talk, while up here people are kind but a bit more reserved. The vibe just seems to lend itself to introversion. Back when I waitressed down south, the customers were a lot chattier. Up here, folks seem to prefer keeping to themselves a bit more. It was close to closing time, and the kitchen's last call was at 2 a.m. Technically, the diner was advertised to close at 2, but it was frowned upon if a customer came in and ordered something right before closing. Yet that night, someone did just that. Only 2 of us were working, myself and the chef. Around 1 a.m., A heavy-set man walked in. He was wearing high-waisted jeans, a gray shirt tucked into a brown jacket, and had a brown mustache and glasses. I asked if he'd like to sit at the bar or table, and he chose a table, smiling the entire time. I gave him a menu and informed him that the kitchen would be closing in 10 minutes. He scanned the menu briefly and ordered a black coffee and French toast, introducing himself as Nolan. His order was simple enough, so I relayed it to the chef, who responded with a slightly annoyed look, which I shrugged off with a knowing smile. As I brought out Nolan's food, he waved me over and struck up a conversation a bit unusual at this hour. He asked if I was from the area and mentioned all the potholes on the roads. I made some small talk, telling him I was from the area, though I kept the details vague. He seemed like a bit of a quirky, nerdy older guy, and I figured this might have been his idea of flirting. Having dealt with similar interactions before, it didn't bother me much. Since he was the last customer, the chef personally brought out the food to the counter. I stayed behind the counter, a little further away from Nolan, hoping to signal that I was done with the conversation. My social energy was drained, and I was ready to head home. Once he finished eating, I dropped off the check before he even asked, subtly indicating we were closed and ready to leave. He paid with a card and finally left. The chef would close up the place, so after cleaning Nolan's table and gathering my belongings, I said goodbye to the chef and walked out to my car. There were 3 cars in the lot, mine, the chef's, and a third one I didn't recognize, a silver, older-looking car, maybe a 2005 Toyota or Audi. I couldn't tell if anyone was inside because it was so dark, and I couldn't see through the windows. I wondered if it was Nolan's car as I got into mine and started heading home. The drive was about 20 minutes, and as I was on the highway, a ding came from my dashboard, alerting me to low tire pressure. I started to panic. I didn't know how to change a tire and had never used my roadside assistance. My rear passenger tire's pressure was dropping fast, and soon the entire car was shaking. I had to pull over. I came to a stop, got out to check the tire, and found it completely flat. Suddenly, headlights lit up the road behind me as a car approached and slowed to a stop. I quickly got back inside and locked the doors, unsure what to do. Then there was a light tap on my window. I looked up to see Nolan, the man from the diner, smiling and waving at me. He was now wearing gloves. For the sake of the story, I'll use a fake name for myself. Nolan leaned closer to the window. "Kathy, is that you? Are you okay?" He laughed, acting as if this was just a coincidence. My stomach twisted. I knew instantly that he was behind this. He motioned for me to roll down the window, so I lowered it just enough to speak through, maybe 2 inches. He asked if I needed help, and I told him I had a flat tire. Playing dumb, he asked which one, so I told him it was the rear passenger side. He walked around to the other side, and while he was out of sight, I dialed 911 and kept the phone on my lap. When he came back, he offered to help change the tire, smiling in that unnerving way. I told him my boyfriend was on his way to help, hoping to deter him. The 911 operator was speaking quietly on the other end, and I tried to respond to her without being obvious. I mentioned that I wasn't sure how I got a flat, but that my boyfriend would be here soon. Nolan's expression changed, and he stepped away from the window. I took the chance to whisper to the operator that a man had slashed my tire and was trying to get me out of the car. She asked for my location, and I quickly checked my map to tell her the road I'd pulled off on. Suddenly, I heard the shattering of glass as my driver's side window exploded. I screamed as shards fell onto my lap, and I yelled that I was on the phone with the police, showing him the screen. He glanced at it, reached in, grabbed my phone, and hurled it toward the highway before running back to his car and speeding off into the darkness. I wanted to search for my phone, but without a flashlight, I was alone in the pitch dark. I had no choice but to wait, praying that Nolan, or whatever his real name was, wouldn't come back. Thankfully, I'd managed to give the operator my location, and I soon heard police sirens in the distance. Tears of relief filled my eyes as the flashing lights turned onto my road. I got out of my car and waved to the officers as they pulled up. A second police car arrived, and then a third. They were incredibly kind and helpful. They even changed my tire and gave me an escort home, with one officer leading me as I followed behind. The main officer assured me they'd check the diner's surveillance footage and keep me updated. A week later, I received a call from that officer. The investigation was ongoing, but they were still reviewing the footage. That was the last I heard. I don't think they ever caught him. I never went back to that diner job after that night. I wasn't about to risk him finding me again. I'm not going to call myself an expert hiker, but I've been avidly enjoying it for a few decades now. I've traversed all the major trails in America and have visited over 75% of this country's national parks. Because of that, I've had to find new ways to excite myself. Recently, I picked up a new hobby scouring Google Maps for vast, unnamed forests and just exploring them. It's a little unconventional, but I think the added excitement is worth the risk of getting lost, or at least I did. I carry a pack of homemade route marking stickers that I periodically stick onto trees so I don't lose my way back. As I pass each one on my return, I pull them off so I don't leave litter behind. I'm surprised more people haven't picked up on this trick. It makes getting lost nearly impossible. This time around, I had a more daunting task ahead of me, exploring Dudleytown Forest in Connecticut. For most people, this would give them pause. In case you don't know, the entire town has been abandoned since the 1800s, with all kinds of eerie stories about strange happenings. If you're into that, you should definitely look it up. I'm not superstitious and I don't believe in ghost stories, so it didn't bother me. Technically, the forest is off limits to the public, but that hasn't stopped me before. I saw it as a guarantee that I wouldn't encounter anyone, which is exactly what I wanted. Since I'm from New England, the drive wasn't too bad. I entered the woods around noon to make sure the sun wouldn't set before I finished. My first impression was surprisingly unsettling. I had heard it was dead silent in there, and it was. You don't really notice or appreciate all the sounds in a forest until they're gone. Imagine closing your eyes in a silent room where you can only hear your breathing. That's exactly what it felt like. The silence wasn't entirely new to me. I've been in forests devoid of animals before. I continued placing my stickers and tried to shake the eerie feeling. I kept expecting to come across an animal or some other sign of life, but there was nothing. After a while, I was honestly hoping to run into a person, anything to break the isolation. But after a while, the silence stopped bothering me. For the first time since I'd entered the woods, I felt calm. That feeling didn't last long, though. Out of nowhere, I heard a sound that sent a chill down my spine. It was like a wailing or moaning, the kind of noise a wounded animal might make. That's the best way I can describe it, and even now I struggle to explain it accurately. The fact that it was the only sound in the entire forest made it all the creepier. I paused and listened, trying to figure out what it could be. I considered that it might be the wind whistling, but there was no wind at all. I concluded it was likely a wounded animal, though I didn't fully believe it. I decided to walk away from the sound until it faded. You're probably wondering why I didn't just turn around and leave. I wish I had an answer for that. I told myself if one more strange thing happened, I'd leave. As I continued, I started wondering how an animal could have gotten injured in a forest like this. Was someone hunting here? But I hadn't heard any gunshots. Maybe it happened before I arrived, or maybe the hunter didn't finish the job, though I couldn't imagine someone doing that. Lost in thought, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. On the tree directly in front of me were actual carvings. I know it sounds cliché, but I'm serious. They weren't letters, they were symbols, just random slashes and patches of missing bark. I looked around and saw that several nearby trees had similar marks. That was it for me. I turned around immediately and began following my trail markers back, thinking, screw this. I followed my markers for a while, then noticed something odd up ahead, a cave, or what looked like a bear's den. I froze, confused. I know myself, and there's no way I would have overlooked something like a bear's den. That's when it hit me. My trail marker should have been shoulder high, not waist high. My blood ran cold. I turned and sprinted back, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Someone had moved my stickers, trying to lure me toward that cave. But how? Could someone really have been tracking me this whole time? I didn't have time to dwell on it. I was focused on getting the hell out of that forest. The problem was, without those trail markers, I was as good as lost. I kept running, making no attempt to be quiet. It would have been pointless in the dead silence of the woods. After a while, I stopped to catch my breath and pulled out my phone, praying for a signal. Miraculously, I had one bar. I quickly checked my car's location on the map and figured out which direction to head. Just then, the signal dropped, but it didn't matter. I knew where I was going. And that's when the wailing started up again, louder this time. I ran faster than I ever had, even though my most fit years were behind me. The sound seemed to come from right behind me, but every time I looked, I saw nothing. After the longest 10 minutes of my life, I finally reached the edge of the forest, and the wailing stopped abruptly. I jumped in my car and sped off before whatever or whoever had been chasing me could catch up. That day changed hiking for me. Here's my best guess at what happened. Some hermit or forest dweller lives there and noticed me before I noticed him. For some reason, he tracked me and messed with my trail markers, trying to lure me toward that cave. Maybe he used a whistle or some device to make the wailing noise, which is why it stopped so abruptly. Once he realized I wasn't taking the bait, he gave up. I know there are holes in my explanation, like how someone could keep up the wailing while supposedly running at full speed. I'm open to any other suggestions. Maybe there's a reason that forest is off limits to civilians. When my friends and I rented a beach house in Florida, I never could have expected how things would turn out. It was the four of us crammed into a small car driving down there. The house was right on the beach, on a road that had the bay in front of it across the street, and then the ocean literally in the backyard. There were some huge houses on this road and some smaller, more modest ones. Ours was one of the more modest looking ones. The house had 4 bedrooms, so each of us got our own. The houses were spaced out, creating a sense of privacy, and the whole time we were unloading the car, not a single vehicle passed by. The inside of the house was nice enough, not luxurious, but clean, and decorated with a heavy beach theme, even a decorative surfboard behind the TV. The living room opened up to a deck, which led straight to the sand. The view of the beach was amazing. After settling in, the first thing we did was head outside and lie on the beach. We all went into the water at one point, then played some football. We were on the beach for a few hours and only saw an older couple way down the shore. Later, we went out to eat and then started bar hopping in town. When we Ubered back, it was already dark, so we decided to mess around on the beach and play some late-night football while a bit buzzed. At one point, as I ran to grab the ball after missing a catch, I noticed something in the water. The moon was reflecting on the ocean, and that's when I saw a person standing in the water, about waist deep. I muttered, "What the hell is that?" My friends looked over and saw it too. It was strange, given it was well past midnight, but we shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was a local going for a late swim. Afterward, we sat on the deck, drank some beers, and one by one, everyone headed inside to sleep. My friend John and I were the last ones outside. Every once in a while, I glanced toward where I'd seen the person, just out of curiosity. Eventually, when I looked over again, I spotted someone standing on the beach, facing our direction. I tried to ignore it, but John, who was facing them, noticed too. After a few minutes, he whispered, "They're still standing there, just looking at us." I yelled, "Is everything okay?" John asked why I would do that, and honestly, I didn't know what I was expecting. They didn't respond though. Officially creeped out, we headed inside. Travis and Liam were already in their rooms, probably asleep, so John and I decided to call it a night too, wanting a full day ahead. It was around 12:30 or 1 a.m., which was early for us, but we were exhausted from the drive and activities. In my room, after brushing my teeth, I looked out the window to get one last view of the ocean before bed. That's when the creepiness escalated. There was now someone standing right in front of the back deck, facing the house. It looked like a man, judging by the larger frame, and I was pretty sure it was the same person from the beach. I called for John, but he didn't answer, so I ran to his room, banged on the door, and told him to come look. He followed me to my window, but by then, the person was gone. I swore to him I'd seen the same person standing right in front of our deck, just staring. John believed me, but we weren't about to go outside and check. I took one last look to make sure they were really gone, then shut the blinds. But as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there. Who was that person? Why were they creeping around? My thoughts were interrupted by the chilling sound of a fist knocking on my window. My insides felt like they shriveled up, and my heart dropped. I lay there frozen, not daring to move. Moments later, there was another light tap on the glass. I wanted to look, but couldn't gather the courage to lift the blinds. Instead, I ran to the living room, shouting for everyone to wake up. They all came out of their rooms, and no one was at the window when we checked. All 4 of us went out to the deck, turned on the lights, and looked out onto the beach. Nothing. We also checked the front and sides of the house. Still no one. John and I explained to Travis and Liam what they'd missed. We decided to keep the backyard lights on that night. The next day, John and I went to the two closest neighbors and asked if they'd had anyone knocking on their windows or doors. One of the neighbors shared a genuinely eerie story. Just a week earlier, someone had knocked on their door in the middle of the night, and when they asked who it was, the person didn't answer, they just kept knocking. Eventually, the neighbor decided not to open the door. I'm not sure if it was related, but if it was, that only makes this encounter scarier. We spent the rest of the day on the beach, exploring nearby towns and hitting up some bars. Luckily, nothing happened that night, and we left the next day. To this day, I wonder what I would have seen if I'd lifted the blinds that night. I was working a late-night shift at the diner where I'd been employed for a year. It was a rainy night, actually. It was pouring. Nights like these usually meant fewer customers since people don't exactly rush to drive in the rain. I was expecting a slow night, and for the most part it was. I was working until midnight, and closer to the end of my shift, a man and a much younger woman walked in. He looked about 40, and she seemed like she was in her early 20s. They both looked right at me when they walked in, so I went over to greet them and asked how many were in their party. They said just 2, so I led them to a table. They took a while to order, and I noticed they were talking quietly to each other. After they finally placed their order, the man started making small talk with me. I'm generally a talkative person, which is why I've always thrived in the hospitality industry. Since it was a slow night, I figured I'd chat with them. Typical waitress-customer back and forth, but something felt off. The girl barely spoke, leaving the man to do most of the talking. He even asked me a few personal questions, like if I lived alone. At the time, I didn't see it as a red flag, so I casually mentioned I lived nearby. Eventually, I left their table to tend to other tasks. About 45 minutes later, they finished and left. An hour later, we closed up the diner, and I said goodbye to my coworkers, rushing to my car to avoid getting drenched in the rain. I drove home slowly due to the weather, and as soon as I got to my place, I went straight inside. My living situation was a bit unique. I rented the middle floor of a 3-apartment house, each floor accessible via a shared stairway from a side entrance. After setting my keys down on the kitchen counter, there was a sudden, frantic pounding at the front door. It was nearly 1 a.m., so I had no idea who it could be. I opened the inner door and saw a drenched girl through the glass storm door. She was wearing a gray hoodie with her face partially obscured. She begged me to let her in so she could use a phone. I was hesitant, so I asked if she was lost. She claimed a creepy man was following her and that she needed help. Something about her looked oddly familiar, though. I asked her who the man was and where he was now. She turned around, saying she didn't know, and kept pleading with me to open the door. Then it clicked, she looked just like the girl from the diner. I asked, "Weren't you at the diner earlier?" But she didn't respond. Instead, she turned around and started pounding on the door again, shouting, "There he is." I looked past her and saw a large man slowly approaching the house. My heart raced as I realized it was the same man from the diner. The girl glanced back at me with confusion, as if wondering why I wasn't opening the door. When I saw recognition in her eyes, she turned to the man and screamed, "Go." He suddenly charged at the door, and I quickly slammed the inner door shut and locked it. I didn't hear any more knocks, but I was too scared to check if they were still outside. I went to the stairway to see if any of the other tenants were home, knocking on both the upstairs and downstairs doors. No one answered. I looked out the windows and realized that neither of their cars was parked outside. I was alone in the house. I went back to my apartment and locked the stairway door, trying to make sense of everything. The most obvious explanation was that it was a setup to lure me into opening the door. Suddenly, I realized why the man had asked if I lived alone at the diner. I thought about calling the police but hesitated. I tried to calm down and decided to get ready for bed. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard a knock at the stairway door. I called out, asking who it was, but received no response. I named both of my neighbors, but again, nothing. Finally, I yelled, "If you don't identify yourself, I'm calling the police." Whoever it was knocked once more, and then I heard a voice say, "Your blood on me." Panicking, I ran to my room, locked myself inside, and called 911. I hid in my closet while I spoke with the operator, my heart racing with every noise. The sound of rain and wind outside made the wait feel like an eternity. After what felt like the longest 10 minutes of my life, the operator told me the police had arrived. I let them into the house, and they took my report, searching both the front and backyards. They suggested I find somewhere else to sleep for a few nights, which I gladly did. I quickly packed a bag while they waited and drove to my parents' house to stay the night. The next day, I returned to the house. When I got to the stairway door, my upstairs neighbor was waiting there, looking concerned. He pointed to the door where someone had scrawled a message in marker, "Thanks for the service, Beth." Horrified, I realized this was no random incident. I ended up staying with my parents for a few weeks until things blew over, and I eventually moved to a new apartment nearby. Better safe than sorry. When I was in college, I couldn't afford the extravagant spring break trips to Mexico that all the Greek life people went on. Because of this, I spent my first 3 spring breaks on campus, which I actually didn't mind too much. But by the time spring break rolled around in my senior year, I realized it was basically my last chance to get the spring break experience I'd been missing out on. Mexico was still out of the question since I'd be paying for everything myself. Eventually, my girlfriend Allie found a reasonably priced Airbnb that looked pretty appealing. We figured it could be a nice couple's getaway, so we invited her best friend Leah and her boyfriend Calvin. We were all super excited since we'd never gone on a vacation together before. The place we picked wasn't your typical spring break Airbnb. It was nestled in a secluded, woodsy area in Lake County, California. There was a hot tub, an exposed fireplace, an antique-style record player, and even some cots for stargazing outside. It sounded perfect. The place was about 2.5 hours away, so we'd have a nice, relaxing drive. Unfortunately, Calvin drove a cramped Mini Cooper, so the girls had to squeeze into the back seat. Calvin was a bit insecure about his car and would get annoyed whenever one of us made a comment about it, which we thought was pretty funny. As small as the car was, though, it was a convertible, which made the drive much nicer. We pulled in around 8 p.m. It was pitch dark, and I have to admit, the place looked a little eerie at night with all the lights off. When I say it was in the woods, I mean that the trees blocked the view of all but one of the neighboring houses. The first night was pretty chill. We hung out by the fireplace with a bottle of wine and played some board games. We wanted to try the hot tub, but Calvin was acting a bit pouty for some reason, so we didn't push it. We all just assumed he had something on his mind. The second night, however, was a lot better. We managed to convince Calvin to join us in the hot tub for some drinking games. The hot tub was in a little room off the back of the house, with walls made mostly of screens, so we felt like we were still outside. We were playing Never Have I Ever with music blasting, having a lot of fun. We were all more than a little buzzed at that point. Then, out of nowhere, a flash of bright light filled the spa room. If it had been raining, we would have thought it was lightning, that's how bright it was. I quickly turned the music off, and we all stared at each other, too nervous to say anything. I quietly got out of the hot tub and walked out to the back deck, trying to see what had caused the light. I looked out into the woods, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. Suddenly, I heard a clicking sound coming from the woods. A few seconds later, another click echoed from a different direction, followed by a whistling sound. The sounds kept coming, clicking and whistling from so many directions it was impossible to keep track. I shouted for Calvin and the girls to get inside, and we all ran back into the house, huddling together in the living room, unsure of what to do. At first, I thought it might be some dumb prank, which is why we didn't call the police right away. A few minutes later, someone started banging on the front door. The girls were hysterical, so I told Calvin to call the police while I grabbed the biggest knife I could find in the kitchen. I yelled in a deep voice that I had a gun, hoping it would scare off whoever was outside. The banging stopped, and Calvin said the police were on their way. But given how remote the area was, it could be a while before they arrived. We waited in tense silence for a few minutes, hoping it was over. Just when we thought we were in the clear, one of the living room windows shattered as someone threw a massive rock through it. The girls screamed, and I told everyone to run upstairs and lock the door. I stayed downstairs, bracing myself for a fight, but by some miracle, no one tried to come through the broken window. Eventually, I approached the window to inspect it and noticed a piece of paper taped to the rock. Scrawled in black ink were the words, "Go away. You shouldn't be here." The police arrived shortly after and did a thorough search of the property, but of course they found nothing. We weren't about to stick around though. We packed up and left that night. The Airbnb hosts ended up giving us a refund, though they refused to talk about what had happened. My girlfriend thinks there's something the owner wasn't telling us, and maybe she's right. It could explain why the place was so cheap. Either way, I don't think I'll be taking any vacations or using Airbnb anytime soon.